Hello, assalamu alaikum.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
All right, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Welcome everyone to our HDS Muslims Q&A with Dr. Khalid Abu al-Fadl. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know that some folks are still rolling in, so folks are welcome whenever. My name is Ramin, and I'll be moderating today's program with Hiram, our president of HDS Muslims. And just to note, we are recording over Zoom for archival purposes. Professor, we'll also be changing the camera so you'll be able to see the audience momentarily. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with the incredible scholar who we are hosting today, but I just want to get us started with a bit of an introduction. Dr. Khalid Abu al-Fadl is one of the world's leading authorities on Sharia, Islamic law, and Islam, and a prominent scholar in the field of human rights. Raised between Kuwait and Egypt, Dr. Abu al-Fadl has undergone traditional madrasa training under numerous shuyukh, including Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali, before moving on to obtain degrees from Yale, UPenn, and Princeton. For over 3 decades now, Dr. Abu al-Fadl has investigated the interplay between modern human rights norms and the Islamic jurisprudential tradition. He was also one of the first Islamic law professors to hold a 10-year track position in an American law school. At UCLA Law, he teaches courses including, but not limited to, international human rights, Islamic jurisprudence, Muslims' race in the law, and the trafficking of human beings. Dr. Abu al-Fadl was also formerly the chair of the Islamic Studies Interdepartmental Program at UCLA. Moreover, he is the founder of the Usuli Institute, which is a nonprofit educational institute dedicated to ethics, beauty, and critical thinking in the Islamic intellectual tradition. Now, perhaps most significantly, over the past 2 years, Dr. Abu al-Fadl has been presenting his tafsir, or original English commentary of the Quran. Titled Project Illumine, this is a major study of the Quranic treatment of ethical norms and mortality. And the tafsir is morality. And the tafsir is in the process of being published into a multi-volume work. In the meantime, all of the recordings of his tafsir are available for free on the Usuli Institute's YouTube page. Welcome. Please join us in the middle. Welcome, welcome. And in full disclosure, I personally had the privilege of learning from Dr. Abu al-Fadl as my beloved sheikh prior to coming to the Divinity School. So I feel immensely blessed and grateful to be welcoming him here today. I can tell you that Dr. Abu al-Fadl has a number of commitments and demands. So the fact that he has graciously volunteered his time to speak to us all today is greatly appreciated and valued. We are so grateful. Thank you, Dr. Abu al-Fadl. So we have just under 2 hours, which will go by much faster than it seems. So we're going to go ahead and dive in. I'm going to start off by presenting the professor with just a couple of central questions, and then we're going to move on to welcome any and all questions from the folks here at HDS. So Dr. Abu al-Fadl, a few years ago, you delivered a khutbah at Princeton University titled The Accountability of Privilege. In this khutbah, you described a feeling of hope as more Muslims attend influential academic spaces like Harvard and other prestigious universities. You qualify this statement, however, by stating that an ethical awareness of Islam must be maintained by the privileged students who enter these spaces. You also said that, quote, the extent of your accountability is directly proportional to your privilege. Given our status here today as mostly Harvard students, I was wondering if you can start off by speaking more on this topic of accountability and privilege.
Thank you, Rami. Thank you for the introduction. First, I'm very happy to be with you, and as always, it's wonderful seeing you. And I apologize for the delay in starting. I had some health challenges. Yeah, there is, of course, the rather obvious moral issue that anyone anyone that is raised with any relation to Islam whatsoever is well aware of. That is the greater your blessings on this earth, the greater your opportunities, um, the greater your material wealth, uh, the greater your abilities. Uh, from a basic concept of justice in Islam, the greater your accountability. The Quran emphasizes this point a million times, that um, and leave alone, of course, the Sirah, um, which expounds on this in numerous ways. But I think, and I think this is rather an obvious one. We all know it, but knowing something is one thing. Um, it, Turning a known thought into an actual motivation for or an actual normative imperative in one's life, where it actually defines or directly influences our behavior, is quite another. But I think the thing that concerns me most, about, to be quite frank and honest about this point, the thing that concerns me most about a lot of the Muslim intellectuals that um, are privileged and have the these types of opportunities of privilege, um, is that, one, there is a very heavy attrition rate. Many of these students, um, having attended elite institutions, are naturally exposed to an elite education, the best minds, the best academics, and so on and so forth. And when they contrast the intensity and fluidity and sophistication of thought that they encounter in their university settings to the very unsophisticated thinking that takes place in Muslim communities, and the way that Muslim communities practice Islam uh, in a highly ritualized fashion that eschews or rejects, um, it, it, that doesn't even make an effort to become aware of the epistemological challenges of the age. A lot of Muslim young people, when they are confronted by this, they lose their Islamic allegiances and their affiliations and their. So I know quite a few Muslims that went to the best schools, graduated from the best schools, but if they used to be nominally, or if they used to be Muslim in terms of their sense of consciousness, their sense of belonging, their sense of loyalty at school, in practice, it's completely gone. And then when they go out to the world of practice, in fact, they exaggerate their attempt to perform in performing whiteness, and their attempt to become, want to engage in white passing, and to associate themselves with all the types of issues that um, are um, quite frankly issues that those who are the elite and hold power, which tends to, which, in 99.9% of situations are white people, are the type of issues that they champion and they favor. The second thing that concerns me about Muslims who have this type of privilege Um, um, that you know what? Let's come back to this because I'm blanking. I'm still
Yeah.
under a little bit of the effects of the pain, so I blanked out on the second point, but we'll come back to it.
Yeah. No worries. I should share with folks, actually shortly before the program, we were considering postponing tonight's Q&A because Dr. Abu Fado was experiencing a lot of pain. So just to reiterate how grateful we are for you being here with us. Sorry, Joe in the back, could we change to the audience camera? And can I just make sure, can everyone hear all right? Yeah, okay, great. I just have one more question for you, Professor, before we open up to the remainder of the questions from our audience here today. But thank you again for that point. I mean, on the performance of whiteness, that is the moral cop-out that a lot of privileged students end up going. Taking that route, I think is so important to highlight. So thank you for that. But the next question is that I think that many of us, even in this room, share the experience that as graduate students, we're often told to lay low and to quietly focus on our studies. That if we're too, quote unquote, politically active, we might be discredited and our scholarship might not even be taken as seriously. So my question is, how do you suggest young Muslims navigate the academy in dynamic ways when so much quietist thought prevails in the spaces that we're learning in?
Yeah, this is actually part of the sad reality. Here's what I've repeatedly experienced and the real risk, right? When I started out through this journey, I had many colleagues and friends who started out the journey more or less at the same time. And the logic is, well, we're going to lay low until we get hired. We're going to lay low until we get tenure. And I'm trying to think of an exception, but in the vast majority, maybe, I mean, actually, I could think of one exception, but in the vast majority, this became a habit. Laying low became a, so put it bluntly, even after these friends made tenure, even after they were hired, and even after they made tenure, the fact that they have lived committed to a committed to a way of life of acquiescing and kneeling before power and not clashing with power and not defying power and not standing up to issues. The very fact that they feel embarrassed if they are now to change course, that before their colleagues will sort of give them that look like, what happened to you? Were you always hiding these feelings, these motives, etc., etc.? So they become quietist until they retire, and even after they retire, I don't know a single one of these people that after retirement suddenly start raising their voice. This is the real challenge. Is it true that if you speak out, you have a harder time in the marketplace? Absolutely, it is true. Is it true that you could be politically targeted and tainted and sort of put on the the blacklist, if you will? It is true. Yes, it is true. Um, But you have to balance this against the fact that once you bravery is like a muscle that you exercise, and so is cowardliness. Being cowardly becomes a psychological habit and orientation where you even start you start becoming annoyed by those who are not cowardly and by those who do speak out. You yourself have acclimated yourself to the idea that um, let's not make waves. That when someone else makes waves, it starts disturbing you. So that is a real challenge. That is a real issue, and we should talk about it more. We should discuss this because it is a real issue.
Yeah, no, I just want to highlight how valuable it is, your advice to navigate balancing, because we know that the very real threat from the Zionist movement, for example, that actively cancels careers. I mean, we're here at Harvard, where Alan Dershowitz has notoriously come for so many Palestinian voices. We also know Steven Saleta, who you've talked about before, who is actually a tenured professor and lost his job as a tenured professor for speaking for Palestinian liberation. So thank you so much for that advice.
No, I have a student at UCLA Law, Jewish student, very bright, graduated from Stanford. She was hired by Associated Press, and after she was hired, the various Zionist organizations launched a witch hunt against her because, well, they knew that she was often critical of the way Israel treated Palestinians, especially being Jewish and especially coming from a family of Holocaust survivors. And they found a tweet on occasion of something where Israel had done something, and the usual, killing Palestinians and so on. And she tweeted something about Israel's barbarity, and they got her fired from Associated Press. And so these things are quite real. I mean, there are many examples of things like that. And this of course by the same people that hold a gazillion events and publish a million articles and books talking about how Muslims can't understand free speech and how Muslims are not committed to freedom of speech. And of course, the obvious paradox is something that they never pay any attention to. But it is your job to do that. It is your job to emphasize the paradox. It is your job. They're not gonna. Don't expect anyone to see with a critical eyesight if the bravery of great criticism doesn't come on Muslim issues from Muslims. I mean, that is the thing that I find the most frustrating about Muslims, especially Muslims who attend elite institutions. It is as if they expect other people to do the work for them. It is as if they expect, non-Muslims, because in all the activity with Human Rights Watch, I would rarely run into a Muslim who, and quite often I would encounter the attitude among my Muslim colleagues, let Christians and Jews or atheists or whoever it is bring attention to the plight of the Yemenis, to the plight of the Palestinians, to the plight of the Syrians, to the plight of the Rohingyas, to the plight of the Uyghurs, to the plight of the Bosnians. When we had the Bosnian rape camps, I mean, I could tell you stories about colleagues who were in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton, who for truly confounding to me, thought that if they raised their voice on the Bosnian rape camps, that this will endanger their possibilities of finding employment as a graduate of the Near Eastern Department at Princeton. So even an ethical issue like, and I don't, you guys are probably too young to remember the Bosnian rape camps, but it was horrendous. I mean, scores of Muslim and non-Muslim women, Croatian and Bosnian women, were put in these rape camps where they were systematically raped over and over and over. And of course, many of them became pregnant and were forced to abort their babies, etc., etc. And I could tell you stories about how frustrating it was to get Muslims to have a sense of ownership over a Muslim issue, to have a sense of bravery. We invited the Bosnian ambassador when we were studying at Princeton as graduate students, and I got money from several organizations to invite the Bosnian ambassador to come on campus and speak about what was happening in Bosnia at the time. And I mean, subhanAllah, the people that helped the most, ultimately that helped me get this done, were non-Muslims, because again, Muslim students, especially the graduate students, would say we can help, but as long as no one finds out, and as long as behind the scenes, and as long as but even when it came to, can you come with me to meet with this university administrator or that, to try to get funding, they would say no, because the word will get around that we're active on the Bosnian issue, and that might endanger out. And you have to ask yourself at that point, if that's the price that you are going to pay to get your ideal job, you have certain people, of course, back then, Bernard Lewis was quite influential in the market. To get Bernard Lewis to give you the okay, is it worth it? And I hope that that's something we can talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you so much for especially sharing some of these personal anecdotes that help us better understand and consider the issues here, and how overall the onus is on us as Muslim graduate students. I'm also thinking here about your earlier response on accountability and privilege. Now I do have some more questions prepared, but we want to open up to audience questions. So we've received some thought-provoking questions. So I know that there are some great questions in mind already. And I just want to emphasize that folks are encouraged to ask whatever they want. You should feel free in this space to share whatever is on your mind. We often say at Usuli that there is no embarrassment in religion, so we hope to receive sincere questions. So Hiram will go ahead and pass around the mic. If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, please. Don't be shy. Naman?
Hello. Assalam, Sheikh Khalid. I was curious if you could talk about the motivations behind your particular academic journey. So pursuing law first, and then your PhD. What was it that inspired you to take that particular path?
I always I mean, it's yeah. I always my early passion and fascination was with the Sharia tradition. If it is a remarkably rich and nuanced intellectual tradition that is often misunderstood and mistreated by Muslims and non-Muslims alike. And so the idea, I come from a family of lawyers and judges and shuyukh and so on. In other words, people who in one way or another either were experts in Egyptian secular law or experts in Sharia. But it is the jurisprudential tradition that has always been especially of a special category and a special place, at least in the family I was raised in. And so what I've going to an American law school, I truly wanted to understand how law is spoken about in a modern age. Perhaps part of what influenced my thinking at the time, to be quite honest, is the political difficulties I had in Egypt and the realization that returning to Egypt might not be a feasible option. I mean, initially when I came to the United States, I dreamt of going back home and making a difference and all of that. But as you adapt more and more to the idea that if you go back home, your fate is going to be disastrous as long as you take the Quranic command that you bear witness for God and constantly uphold the cause of justice. If you're committed to justice, and you can say, and you cannot separate between justice and the divine, and you see the two as in parallels and interlinked, your fate in a dictatorial country like Egypt is horrible. It took, after law school and practicing for a short period of time, it became quite clear to me that, I actually was hired out of law school by a securities law firm where I was doing securities in Washington, D.C. And it became very clear to me that although the money was very nice, it was not a career I can commit to. Working, defending rich people so that they can be richer just didn't feel very good. And the corporate environment of law firms, high-end law firms like that. And although I did work for community legal services for a period of time throughout law school and afterwards for a couple of years, I was always active with community legal services in Philadelphia. Just the field of legal practice itself, the larger intellectual issues was what really attracted me, and that's why I went to that's why I pursued a doctorate from Princeton afterwards. A lot of students, by the way, because when I was hired at UCLA, about 20% of the faculty were JD, PhD. Now at UCLA, about 50% of the faculty are JD, PhD. The percentages of JD, PhDs in law schools is rising as more and more people pursue that option of JD, PhD. It is said that if you have a JD, PhD, you're pretty much guaranteed a job in a law school. You're pretty much guaranteed that you'll be hired sooner or later at a law school. You know, there are about 130 law schools, or around 130 law schools in the US. And they're ranked very differently, but the point is that you'll be hired somewhere. A lot of students don't do a law degree first and then a PhD, they actually reverse it, which probably is a good idea. Probably the way I did it was not the best way. If someone is asking me advice, I would say getting a PhD first and then going to a law school, then getting your JD is a much better option. The advantage of that is that the chances that you will be hired as an academic by a law school are very high. The advantages of teaching at a law school as opposed to a history department are numerous. The prime among them is freedom. The Orientalist tradition that is prevalent and suffocating in the humanities has no impact in law schools. I mean, if it's imposed in a law school, it's self-imposed. But you are completely free to ignore it, and that will have no consequences on your academic trajectory within a law school.
Thank you, Dr. Abu Fadl. We have a number of folks who I guess also did it the quote unquote wrong way with JD, PhD in this room as well. So quite interesting take there. More questions, please. Yes, Saeed.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. Honor and privilege to be able to ask you a question live. I have many, but I'll try to keep it short. One thing I've been thinking about a lot, especially after engaging a lot with your lectures and books that you've written, is trying to figure out the balance of pushing yourself and growth through discomfort, and refining yourself, being on the path of purification, being on the path of tazkiyah, while also not necessarily breaking yourself in the process through just completely inflicting misery upon yourself. So I guess the main question I'm asking really is that there seems to be in life, for all good things, a certain amount of pain one must endure, both external or internal. And at the same time, you want to be making sure that you're not making yourself suffer unnecessarily. And it seems like at a certain point in life, you have to figure out what that balance is for yourself. And so I was curious, from your point of view in the Islamic tradition, and as someone who's clearly engaged in this process, how does one cultivate that kind of internal guide where you want to follow your heart, but you're also not being deceived by your heart, you're not falling into complacency, but you're also not putting yourself through undue misery just because you think that's somehow there's some good in just simply being miserable, if the question makes sense.
Listen, let's be very clear. Misery is never its own cause or its own purpose. I mean, sometimes, in fact, if one is engaging in proper irtiqa or elevation through tazkiyah and otherwise, they're not miserable. Far from it. In fact, the whole point is that you find not just happiness, but quite often ecstasy in the divine path, in the Sirat. And let me just be a bit more even concrete than this and say that um, for irtiqa and tazkiyah, it is critical that one be the biggest challenge is to be brutally honest with the self. I often will get messages, not even just the messages, but even my own challenges that I confronted in my own life. Whatever bitterness that is there, especially bitterness towards other human beings, is often when one truly looks at the self with all honesty and truthfulness, one will often find that the source of this bitterness is that you are sitting in judgment over people rather than over yourself. So, for instance, in enduring a certain hardship, you always look at, well, why didn't people do X? Why didn't people do Y? But when you are truly honest with the self, and if you confront the self, you will find that if you were similarly situated and people were enduring the plight that you were enduring, that, and if you are brutally honest with yourself, that you would not have extended the type of help that you are judging other people for. So, for instance, I'll often get messages, this and this happened, and people didn't do this and didn't do that and didn't do this. And if you are brutally honest with yourself, and you ask yourself, to what extent do you actually perform or you actually do what you condemn people for not doing? And you'll find that, and that is a source of a lot of bitterness, and that is a source of a lot of anger. Irtiqa doesn't just come from sitting and doing dhikr. Yes, dhikr is important, but irtiqa is to elevate through service. You must, and service teaches selflessness. One is constantly performing service, and it is the constant performance of service. And if you must teach yourself to find happiness in service, because people who tell me, well, yeah, I do service, but I'm miserable doing it, that means that the self needs to be purified. There is no irtiqa without service, and without it's not just in the state of khalwa for 40 days and doing dhikr. That's just a step towards irtiqa. But true irtiqa comes from constant service and happiness while performing service. And that's where elevation comes from. And that's there's no place for misery in that. If you are talking about sacrifices, that when one adheres to principles. So I'll give you a very concrete example, and I'm not sure if you had something like this in mind. I knew that as an academic, that I knew fully well that as an academic, if I start giving Friday sermons, which I thought are important because evaluating a million different factors, I've decided that it is really important to, in my view, elevate and demonstrate how Friday sermons have become anemic throughout the Muslim world, unfortunately, and have become a major source of intellectual dullness and intellectual apathy, and moral apathy and moral dullness throughout the Muslim world. And I became convinced that I should practice what I preach. I can't keep writing about the state of Muslim discourse without actually showing how it can be performed and elevated. But I knew fully well that once I start giving khutbahs or sermons, and once I start doing a tafsir of the Quran, that's not good for your academic trajectory. You immediately, in the eyes of the cool bunch, especially your fellow cool Muslims, the secularized, westernized, whiteized, white performing Muslims, you're backwards. You're gross. You've become a sheikh, an imam, poopies. Yuck. As opposed to an academic professor, intellectual and all of that. It's a payoff. And I've decided I don't care enough about academic prestige. And I decided I don't care enough about the type of opportunities, for instance, being appointed in special capacity offices where you are performing services for the chancellor's office and the provost's office. And once you became an imam and you were attacked by the Islamophobes for being an imam, or giving khutbahs and so on, because Islamophobes track me, and I'm sure they'll attack this speech as well. They even, when I spoke to the Muslim Law Association, they promptly published an article that I knew that I was going to lose these opportunities. And there's a financial cost to them, because you're paid for extra services in the university. For if you're appointed by the chancellor to do something, you're given $20,000-$30,000 extra. But that's the nature of all matters of life. You have to make these moral choices. I'll even give you another serious moral choice. Everyone that is, if you become prominent in the field, if you're a Muslim and you become prominent in the field of Islamic law or Islamic theology, at one point or another, you will be approached by the Imarat and you will be offered a handsome amount of money. And you have to make the choice. As unfortunately, there are ways you can justify and philosophize away. This is just an academic grant. They're helping me, do my very important research. But there are consequences to everything.
Thank you for that, Dr. Abu Fadl, and thank you for that wonderful question. On the note of your sermons, I do want to mention that Grace Song, the executive director at the Usuli Institute, along with an amazing volunteer, Marwa, has sent us free copies of The Prophet's Pulpit, Commentaries on the State of Islam. This is a collection of the Sheikh's, Dr. Khalid's, brilliantly edited khutbahs, which speak truth to power and are exactly the kind of Islam that is so needed today. So I encourage you all at the end of the program to get yourself a copy. More questions, please. And don't be shy. I also have some from a few folks who couldn't attend today. But we'll go ahead and go here. Down here.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for speaking with us. So, my question is about a phenomenon which I'm observing in the past 20 years or so, where the general public are using the internet to criticize ulama. And these ulama may be picking positions that they disagree with, and they criticize the ulama or scholars online. And as a result, I'm seeing many young people who don't trust ulama, and they don't know who to follow, even for learning basic things. And so young people, for example, this Ramadan may not want to learn from 90% of the public ulama because of the public discourse. So I wanted to ask generally, what is the adab of criticizing the ulama from the awam, from the general public?
Yeah, that is a good and a tough question. I mean, it's a tough question because um, I could give you the traditional response about uh, 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 the adab of dealing with ulama, and I mean, and the rules of adab are they're easily accessible in the tradition, from matters of husnul zan, or that you giving them the benefit of the doubt, and um eh, not anyway. But I want there is an epistemological reality in the age we live. And in the age that we live, this age of free flow of information, number one, I don't know if you guys saw the article in the New Yorker that came out recently about the Emirat and the smear campaigns, paying for smear campaigns against various figures. The net is truly a jungle of smoke of mirrors, full of smoke and mirrors, because it is not just the Emirat that is pouring money and trying to shape public opinion in one way or the other. I can tell you from direct and intimate experience that it is also Saudi, it is also Egypt, it is also Israel, it is also various evangelical organizations. Oh my God. I mean, I could write a book about the money spent by evangelical organizations, to the extent that I found out about an Islamic center in England that is fully funded. And I found out in a lawsuit, by the way. It is fully funded by a Christian organization. I mean, we live. There is a very rich Texan woman, a Christian evangelical woman, who gives millions of dollars to this organization out of Greece that does nothing but 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, try to influence which figures. So they spent a great deal of money, for instance, maligning and slandering Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and especially when he passed away. And so you're living in a world where even someone like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, with his prodigious scholarship, you have not just Muslims. I mean, you don't understand if it's the Emirat and the Egyptian government and I don't know who, trying to influence the way people think about Yusuf al-Qaradawi, but even Christian and Zionist organizations. And so the net is truly a mess. So that's one, and it is truly just full of smoke and mirrors. You read something you don't know, and that is why, like with my students, I absolutely am very suspicious if they cite in their papers anything from the net. I told them I want sources. I want serious scholarly sources, cite paper and ink. Don't give me a site to some internet source, because I don't trust it. I don't trust anything coming from the net. But the second point is that yes, we there's an adab in dealing with the ulama, but the very question of who is an alim in our day and age has become complicated and obscured. because an alim is not just someone who has knowledge of Shari'i sciences, but is someone who is a truly alim in the meaning of a person of true knowledge, being anchored in Shari'i sciences and anchored in the modern and systems of knowledge of the day and age. Part of the frustration you find among the youth with ulama is a breach of trust, a true breaking of trust. And I don't think that trust is going to be fixed by simply teaching them about the adab, because there is a true crisis of authority in modern Islam, and a true crisis of authority, in my view, that is a direct product of corrupt authoritarian centers of power, constantly, since colonialism, influencing and shaping and engineering and directing and channeling Muslim religious discourses. I mean, when we say, do I think of the ulama that are part of Rabitat al-Alam al-Islami in Saudi, as opposed to a Rabita in Qatar, as opposed to the ulama that are on CC's payroll at Azhar, as opposed to the ulama that are closer to Sheikh al-Azhar, who tries to resist somewhat what CC demands, as opposed to the Azhari ulama that are in exile, because if they go back to Egypt, they'll be promptly thrown in prison, as opposed to the ulama that are sitting in Saudi prisons, like Salman al-Auda, someone who just right before he was imprisoned, I mean, was among the most influential ulama, as opposed to the ulama who are, tell you if the ruler of Saudi Arabia fornicates on TV in public for 15 minutes a day, and this is, an actual fatwa that was given, you can't object, and you can't protest, and you can't even criticize. We have to somehow think seriously about regaining the trust and the confidence of this youth, while teaching them the adab of dealing with the ulama, also being very honest about what criteria must be met for us to recognize someone as alim. Because if you ask me to recognize some very well-known figures in the United States, for instance, as ulama, on the basis just of the fact that they know Tahawi and his treatise, and they've translated the Tahawiyah, no, their moral stance, in my eyes, have disqualified them as ulama. Because they have taken very immoral stance, and I can't, either this is alim who is a fasiq, which I don't dare. That's not a position I'm going to adopt. I'd rather say that this person is not alim than say it's an alim who's a fasiq.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Abu Fadl, so much to further reflect on there. More questions?
Okay, you raised something that really needs honest vetting. I wish, there's, for instance, a Muslim Law Student Association, but unfortunately, the Muslim Law Student Association has become more of a networking opportunity to try to find good corporate jobs, rather than what exists in many other communities, in Latino, Hispanic, the Jewish community, several Asian communities. Even for instance, there's a robust organization of Filipino lawyers that track uh, issues of concern for the Filipino community and um, intervenes in matters of importance in American law. And but unfortunately, that type of Muslims tend to um, the attitude, oh well, let care worry about it. Care can't do everything. Yani, care is overwhelmed, and that ittikal, that attitude of ittikal of, oh, let care worry about handling legal issues of concern for Muslims. And then when CARE is attacked by the Emirat and branded as a terrorist organization, the same Muslim lawyers, again, they adopt a hands-off policy. And if you tell them, let's have a meeting to systematically organize a lobby of Muslim lawyers that can intervene in cases of importance for all Muslims in the United States, that philosophy of activism, of ummah, of wahda, of truly, saying, yeah, let's work together, regardless of whether you are a Sufi, a Wahhabi, a Salafi, a liberal, whatever. I don't care. Let's work together on issues of concern for all of us as Muslims. It is unfortunately, as of this time, completely absent. And it's remarkably, even things like Sunnah and Shia enter. When you're talking about professionals as lawyers, you're supposed to be above that. I mean, you're supposed to have the intellectual sophistication as a professional, not to be influenced by someone telling you, oh, this person is a liberal, don't work with them. Because that's exactly what even right now, Hindus in Britain and in the US and in Canada are so organized, and they actually are an amazing example of what Muslims should do to protect their causes, because they organize, but they organize not to promote Hindu causes, but to attack Muslims and malign Muslims. Anyway, so my point is that I wish Muslim historians in the West, Muslim anthropologists, Muslim sociologists formed the type of professional unions and professional organizations in which they openly discuss issues of concern for all Muslims, and in which they help each other, promote one another. Because what happens, the reality of what happens, and this I've seen a gazillion times, is that you want to enter the field. You learn very quickly that in order to enter the field of Islamic studies, if you adopt normative positions, if your dissertation has a normative argument, if your dissertation or your first set of publications have normative arguments about what should or should not be for Islam, for Muslims, that is not kosher within the prevailing Orientalist methodologies in the field. Orientalist methodologies is that your work is purely descriptive, that you adhere to the mythology, the myth of objectivism. George Saliba said something that I really believe he is absolutely right, and quite the attitude in Orientalism is often towards native Muslims. Don't bother thinking, leave the thinking for us. We are the ones in a position to understand your history, your law, your societies. You can't. You are, as a native people, you can't understand your own law. You can't understand your own history. You're defective somehow. But what Orientalism quite often, and then you find very quickly, and even in my own institution at UCLA, I mean, I can go and tell you gazillion stories about this, is that if you very quickly learn what type of smug attitudes towards Islamic law, towards Islamic history, towards Islamic societies you must adopt and adhere to. Even the tone that you speak about as you go out to dinner and share a glass of wine over dinner and talk about the field, even the tone of smugness and superiority, as if Muslims are inherently defective. And what my experience is, tons and tons of Muslims perform the role perfectly. You can't distinguish a Muslim from a non-Muslim in this field. The smugness, the arrogance, the colonial superior attitude, as when you're looking at colonized people, the bizarre way. I mean, you can't describe law unless you study the field of comparative law. You can't talk about Islamic law as if it is just its own bizarre, growth. You must discourse about Islamic law from the perspective of it being fully anchored in knowledge of comparative legal systems. So you can identify what is truly unique and what is not unique about Islamic law. But you will never find in among the Orientalist NELC departments, history departments, anyone that talks about Islamic law, even if they have a law degree, that will bother to think about Islamic law from the perspective of comparative legal systems, or our comparative knowledge of jurisprudential processes or jurisprudential methodologies, or one of the courses I'm supposed to teach it next year are canons of legal thinking. What jurisprudential science has discovered about legal thinking worldwide and what legal canons are, and yet you'll find in our field people talking about canons of Islamic law who have never read anything about what are legal canons, what is common to legal thinking, why do we find lawyers from around the world from different cultures reproducing certain dynamics, certain processes, while other things they distinguish themselves from. Anyway, so my point is that the real risk is that then I found so many students, they go out of their way to position themselves as merely descriptive scholars who don't have a normative bone in their body, and go out of their way to embrace the image in order to get a job. As I said, the real risk is that do they suddenly, upon getting tenure, become a Fazl Rahman, for instance, and start making normative arguments? Fazl Rahman was making normative arguments, by the way, before he got tenure. But you get the point. And the answer, in most cases, I mean, there are people like, Sashadina, for instance, who really, he started his normative interventions only after he got tenure. There are people, who else can I think of? But these are the exceptions. What tends to happen is that in order to be consistent with the self, in order to resolve the inner paradoxes of the self, in order to make sense of your own self, most never recover this sense of bravery or sense of investment in Muslim issues where they want to make normative interventions, and they remain descriptive Orientalism performing scholars till the very end. My advice to you is my first job out of Princeton. I was in a department in which all my colleagues in this department, I had colleagues who consistently intervened in what I taught about Islamic law. Some colleagues, all they cared about is the extent to which Islamic law is relevant to the Arab-Israeli or Arab or Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and was constantly trying to interrogate me about my views on this matter. I had other colleagues who were their attitude. I mean, we had open conversations about this. Is that Muhammad just basically was an imposter who learned everything he put in the Quran from Christian teachers, and that's the beginning and the end of the matter. And so everything else that followed in the Islamic tradition, it was like that. And I made every concerted effort to get out of that situation. Because I knew that either in order to make tenure in this situation, it will be my moral death. I will amount to nothing. Once I got out, admittedly, my first publication or set of publications were simply to demonstrate that I can do the rigorous scholarly work that would meet the highest standards so that no one can be heard saying, "Oh, he makes the normative arguments because he can't do the type of So the Rebellion book, the studies on Muslim legal discourses on Muslim minorities have few normative arguments. Once I've proven that I can do this work, I very openly and honestly turned to what normative contributions I had to make to issues that confront Muslims. I'm not saying that you should do what I've done, but this is just an example of how I've chose to handle these situations. Along the way, I was very good friends at Princeton. He was someone who was in philosophy, and I observed him as he made his way in the academic world of philosophy and seemed to eventually lose his faith with great amount of sadness, because he was truly a good guy. I had another friend who couldn't resolve the contradictions, except by basically to deconstruct Islamic doctrines into absolute nothing. But at the same time, you do have Sayyid Hassan Nasr, you do have Issa Shadina, you do have Fazlur Rahman, and I think, yes, the path of Fazlur Rahman, I think, is in the age of Islamophobia, is even harder. But it's well worth the price. That's my view.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Professor. Are there more questions here? Before we get to you though, can I ask a quick question from someone who wasn't able to join, Ariella? Really fast, because at this point we've tackled a bit of a lot of impactful questions centered around navigating the university world as an aspiring academic. So I want to interject with this question from a sister around socially affirming spaces. She asks, how can we create spaces that affirm our Muslim queer siblings? Do we have enough work? Do we have enough to work with from the Quran, Hadith, and Fiqh to create queer affirming spaces that are still rooted in our tradition?
Listen, this issue needs a considerable amount of moral bravery. And we need to so I mean, let's put it this way. Just before the spring break, we were spending 2 weeks on the issue of sexual orientation and human rights and the history of rise of the queer rights in the human rights field, in international human rights, and how notions of equality and dignity were expanded to include what are rational categories. In other words, that you should treat all people equally and you should not discriminate and you should not, et cetera, and how the entire world, either from whether we are talking about the Holy See in Rome or the Muslim world, attempted to resist the inclusion of such rights, while the other half of the world argued that what we are, how can you justify notions of discrimination? How can you justify notions of subordination? How can you say that the oppression of a people simply because of the nature of their sexual identity, it can be justified? I think these issues require very honest and brave and moral confrontations and discussions by in Muslim spaces. Several things. Does enough exist in the Quran? And I'll let you be the judge. Listen to what I've said, especially in the context of interpreting the story of Lut in the Quran. Notice that the Sunnah is different, because there are ahadith that are grossly homophobic. But again, I don't think that these are ideologically neutral ahadith. I think that these ahadith, despite the fact that they had problems and chains of transmissions, they were declared authentic anyway. And there are, so the expectation that you can have from the hadith tradition is very different than the expectation that you can have from the Quran tradition. At least that's in my experience. Allahu Alam. Other scholars could make discoveries that are quite different. But the second thing is that you cannot have an honest Muslim conversation about this without the inclusion of the voices of Muslims who represent that perspective. I mean, my education about this issue came from being involved with Muslims who embodied and represented that identity. And that involvement, that intellectual and moral exchange was transformative. And we Muslims have to stop adopting the morally cowardly choice of putting our hands in the sand, and refusing to talk to those who say this is the way God made us, and help us find a solution from within the tradition. And a true alim doesn't just simply run away and say, well, I'm going to cancel you because I don't have a good response to who you are, so I'm just going to cancel your existence in life. Yeah, so that's what I would say on this issue. Till today, the thing that really is very disturbing to me is the young Muslims who will celebrate very questionable personalities like Jordan Peterson, for instance. Muslims who, just because they want to hold on to the condemnation of homosexuality and a normative outlook that creates no moral spaces for for any type of reconstruction when it comes to homosexuality and so on. They will embrace and support and champion figures like Jordan Peterson, these right wing slash Christian slash Zionist whatever perspectives, and that to me is the stupidest thing in the world. It is someone who shoots his foot because his ear is bothering him. It is you embrace the most Islamophobic option. You embrace the people who truly want to exterminate the existence of Muslims in the world, regardless of what sweet talk they engage in, and the stupid gestures, that very disingenuous and superficial gestures that people like Jordan Peterson do. You know what is in their heart. You know that in their heart they absolutely despise Muslims and they wish that Muslims would disappear from the face of the earth. But in order to find allies so you can condemn your homosexual sisters and brothers, you go embrace the most Islam-hating people in the world. It absolutely makes no sense to me, and it's again a sign of how colonized our minds are. We still live with fairly colonized intellects. Why don't we do our own research, not rely on Orientalists, but do our own research on how homosexuals, I mean, in the neighborhood I grew up in, we knew who was homosexual, we knew who was male but did not embrace the male identity. They had a natural place in Egyptian society in the most traditional areas, not in the cosmopolitan Egyptian areas. No one thought. I mean, the guy had when he decided that he wanted to pray in the women's section, the imam laughed and said that's his choice. It was so natural. It came from an completely native, innate. If we were in Cairo, in the cosmopolitan area in Cairo, it would have very quickly become very complicated. Why don't we look into our own native tradition and try to reclaim that tradition instead of running to figures like Jordan Peterson, which is so absurd, so ridiculous.
Thank you so much. And before we turn to Michael's question, I just want to add for folks looking for more on this, Dr. Abu Fadl has actually most recently discussed this topic earlier this month on the Malcolm Effect podcast titled Islam, Muslims and Modernity. And also last year, if you go on the Usuli Institute's YouTube page and search the Surah Al-Namal Q&A, he talks about this extensively as well. So there's more resources there.
Assalamu alaikum, ya Sheikh. Thank you for your efforts. Thank you for your work. May Allah reward you. I wanted to ask you about the balance of culture and deen, because as a convert of the Negro variety, I'm kind of haunted by the question of, is it sunnah to be Arab? And I wanted to ask you about if God listens to prayers and dua and recitations that are not in Arabic. And can you give us guidance on where to look in the tradition and in the Sunnah, and where we can look in the Sharia to balance sort of the imitation of Arabic culture and the cultural imperative to make our own indigenous Islamic traditions, kind of similar to what, Dr. Umar Farouk Abdullah once wrote about. Thank you so much. And Jazakallah.
Also I want to point you to the work of Professor Amina McLeod, who also has, and she also has a television program on the Islamic Broadcast Network, because she's very concerned about these very same types of issues, and her contributions have been enormous and invaluable. But I wanted to say this. We often forget that Islam, there is a huge difference between the language in which the Islamic civilization expressed itself, for the most part, was Arabic. For the most part, not exclusively, because there is remarkable productions, intellectual productions within the Islamic civilization in Persian and in Turkish and in Urdu. But there's a big difference between the language of the civilization, for the most part, being Arabic, and Arabic culture. We forget that Islam, the dominant Islam in the world, or the Islam that pervaded the world, is Islam of Indonesia, the Islam of Malaysia, the numerous forms of Islamic manifestations in Africa, the Islam of India. And when you delve into the Islam that expressed itself in places like Indonesia or India or Africa before colonialism, in no way could you describe it as an Arab Islam. And in fact, we are well aware that the embracing of a native form of Islam was so thorough that when the Arabs came as traders, or later waves of Arabs would come as merchants and traders, and sort of deal with natives from an air of superiority, as if they expected deference, that would lead to racial tensions. And this is, again, before colonialism sets in. And so within Islam in India, the expressed itself with, if you look at the Qawali or the Ghazals in Urdu, look at the Sufi literature in Urdu, look at the amount of dua and prayer that even it became common for, without issue, for people from that tradition to say Khuda Hafiz. What is Khuda Hafiz in Arabic? It's nothing. But yet it didn't scandalize anyone. I mean, till now, I will have converts who will tell me Khuda Hafiz, and as if they don't know that this is not Arabic at all. And in fact, it has nothing to do with, anyway. So my point is that Islam survived. Islam survived not by people embracing Arab culture, but by people nativizing the religion. And does God listen to prayer in language? Does God listen to prayer in Urdu? Does God listen to prayer in Indonesian? Does God listen to prayer in Turkish? Because if the answer is no, then there is an awful lot of prayers and dua and supplications and an extremely remarkably wealthy textual tradition in non-Arabic that talked to God, spoke to God, heights in poetry and in zikr and in qawali and so on. So now the problem is that Islam in the West happens after colonialism. Colonialism had the direct impact of Arabizing the Islamic religion. I have the archives of the British Foreign Office, and it astounds me the extent to which British officers and their Orientalist advisors were completely convinced that Turkish Islam was a corruption, that Egyptian Islam was a corruption, that the true form and authentic form of real Islam, the Islam of the Prophet himself, is the Islam of the desert. And whether consciously or subconsciously, they did everything within their power to put the Islam of the desert in control of the holy sites, and to, through all the leaders that are not educated in Muslim countries, are educated in Western institutions. I don't know if you know this, but it was a condition, for instance, of both French and British colonialism, that the ruling elite have to send their kids to be educated in either France or Britain, where they would be taught that Islam is an Arab religion, and that the Orientalist teachers that we encounter all the time that always act from the assumption that African Islam is an aberration, Turkish Islam is an aberration, Sufi Islam is an aberration. Everything is an aberration except the true authentic Islam that they assume is the authentic Islam, Islam of the desert. Okay, so now add to that when Islam spread in the West, except for these short periods of time when we see nativist movements, like the movement of Malcolm X, unfortunately, the reality is Arab countries, more specifically Saudi Arabia and the Emirat recently, but even look at what, for instance, someone like in Egypt, Sisi has become an ambassador of going around Western countries, including the US, warning Western countries about the growth of Islam in their countries and telling them, I mean, so in other words, the Arab countries, because they're so colonially dependent, couldn't ignore because their gaze is so focused on their colonial masters, it couldn't get beyond the point of seeing the growth of Islam in the former colonial masters, France, Britain, the United States, as their direct business. These countries saw the growth of a Malcolm X movement, and this is, by the way, an article or book that's waiting to be written. How threatening when Malcolm X went to the United Nations and presented the racial issue in the U.S. Initially, Muslim countries were supportive initially, but shortly afterwards, they became terrified. Because if Malcolm X is going to show up in the UN and raise the race issue in the United Nations, what does that mean for the role of the United Nations on other human rights issues that directly intervene with their sovereignty and their power as dictatorial government? And so, and again, I emphasize, I wish someone would research this and write it. Within 2 months after supporting Malcolm X, the entire discourse in the Arab media went from very positive to very critical and negative. That portraying Malcolm X as if it traitor's his own country. My point in all of this is that these dictatorial Arab countries could not leave Islam in the West alone. And it is your role as a native convert to de-Arabize your Islamic experience, to tell whatever comes from these shuyukh, thank you, but no thank you. I have to study my own faith. I have, in the same way that Muslims of India, say Khuda Hafiz, and consider it as natural as it can be, and they call Salah namaz. Where does namaz come from? Why is it that namaz is not controversial, but if you say, you use a French word, that becomes a bid'ah? Islam. That is why Islam doesn't survive in the West, because it cannot. Nothing can survive if it doesn't dig in deep native roots. As long as Islam remains an immigrant phenomena, it will always be a phenomena that disappears very quickly within 2 or 3 generations. The kids of immigrants, because there's a huge gap between their consciousness and the consciousness of their immigrant parents, the attrition rate among the children of immigrants in telling you in law schools and in business schools and oh, my parents are Muslim, or oh, I'm of Muslim origin. I can't tell you for how many times I hear this in law school, for instance, among immigrant Muslims. Of course, we, since the end of affirmative action in California, the sad reality is that we have very few blacks now. But if I'm lucky enough, fortunate enough to get a black Muslim in law school, it's a very different experience than immigrant, the sons and daughters of immigrant Muslims. Very different.
Thank you for what was just a brilliant response and an exceptional question. I think we have a room full of aspiring researchers here, so I hope we take seriously Dr. Abu al-Fadl's call to decolonize de-Arabize, the Islamic experience. I also want to highlight at the start, Dr. Abu al-Fadl mentioned an incredible scholar and activist. Her name is Dr. Amina McLeod Al-Din from Muslim TV Online, and he recently had a conversation with her on YouTube that I highly recommend as well. I can't believe we have just under half an hour until iftar, but please, any more questions?
What time is iftar at where you are?
Iftar for us is at about, for most of us at least, is about 7:10, I believe. So we have
Wow.
about 20 minutes. Is that okay? Can we keep you on?
Yeah, our iftar is at 7:58.
Oh,
wish
wow,
I-
okay.
I wish I was in Boston.
Maybe today we'll be in solidarity with you in your iftar time. Keep it going. Questions, folks? Yes, Mafaz.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Khalid. Thank you so much for being with
Is
us.
this my
I
fam?
have, yes.
Yes.
Salam alaikum, Faz. So nice to see you.
Assalamu alaikum. So nice to see you too, Sheikh. I have a somewhat of a cheesy question, if I may. I think so many of us, I don't know, I'll speak for myself, come into the field of religious studies with a lot of passion for knowledge. I don't think anyone comes into this thinking I'm going to make an illustrious, financial career out of it. And so there is something about that sort of initial drive of love for knowledge that I think can be washed away a little bit as we go through the standard academy. And I'm wondering sort of what is your advice for keeping that love for knowledge as a moral orientation, as a type of worship alive in our hearts, especially as somebody who's kept it alive in his heart for such a long time. Just kind of would love to hear some of your wisdom on that.
Wow, yeah, no, that's not a cheesy question. That's a really tough question. Yeah, you very quickly find that. I mean, this is what some of the so much of Islamic studies, whether it's comes from religious studies or the NELC department or even history departments, is a ghetto field. It's ghettoized. I'll be very honest with you, and I'll tell you that, for instance, much of what is published in Islamic law would not pass muster, would not pass, even come close to passing the standards if it was published in the field of jurisprudence generally. If the people writing on it were like, for instance, people writing on European law. The Islamic studies generally is a ghettoized field, and it's a ghettoized field largely because of Orientalism and the impact of Orientalism, and that it is replete with exceptionalism. I had, excuse me, I know no students from history departments. I'm not going to name the school, so I don't, but who got their doctorates if they were writing on European history or writing on American history. Their lack of command of the sources, their lack of command of methodological issues would have never been allowed to go through if it hadn't been for the fact that they're writing on Islamic history. Now, the reason I mention this is that I think that in this field, that sense of letdown comes precisely from that, is that you want to engage the world of thought and read broadly and engage various intellectual issues, and you find that as you write in the field of Islamic studies especially, that there is a tremendous issue, a tremendous pressure to set aside the universe of serious thinking about serious issues, and that kills the soul, because after a while, if you don't have the freedom to pursue what you consider to be the serious intellectual questions that need to be answered, and you find yourself being pressured to narrow your research and narrow your engagement to issues that have been done a million times over, it becomes very suffocating. How to overcome that? I mean, I'll tell you, I'll tell you that once I made tenure, I made a commitment to myself that no month would go by. It used to be even no 2 weeks would go by without reading something that is purely of interest and nothing but intellectual interest to me. So I'm always forcing myself, especially because if I found that if I'm constantly reading in law, I start becoming, thinking as nearly as lawyers do. And my whole world becomes the world of rules and statutory interpretation and precedent and authority and causistic thinking and deductive thinking, and so I will read, 1 month I'll read something in feminist theory, another month I'll be reading the latest or something in critical race studies. A third month I'll be reading about paranormal activities and ghosts and UFOs, and I'll read whatever my mind becomes curious about, and I will often, if I find that I'm becoming, I will often also force myself to read literature, because literature is a great teacher. Literature disciplines your soul, tempers your soul. I mean, the right type of literature, obviously. I'm not talking about trashy novels. I'm talking about real literature. It reminds you that you have to have the point that I would really worry is the point where I can no longer enjoy a work of literature. That means that my heart and intellect has hardened and become and aged to the point of inflexibility, lack of flexibility, and yeah. I don't know. Yeah, it's not a very good answer, but that's what I do, for whatever it's worth. Read about paranormal activity. It will stretch your thinking quite a bit.
Beautiful, beautiful question and beautiful response. I love that.
The mysteries of the world. There's so many mysteries of the world that we can't answer, and it doesn't make a difference if you're a Muslim, Christian, Jew, or whatever. We all experience these mysteries, and we can't answer them. Try to find a solution to all the UFO questions.
I have to ask, are you reading the paranormal stuff in the third month or every month? Because
no, because you hung around me long enough to know that I read that stuff quite often. It's whenever I start, getting bored with my brain. I want to remind myself there are things that I just cannot find an answer to, and that's good teacher, a good way to discipline yourself.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you. Dr. Abu Fadl, are you okay to keep going? Can we?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay,
we'll still have
and I know
time for
iftar is in
iftar.
10 minutes, so if you do want to break fast, feel free to then, but I want to welcome more questions from folks. Yes, Sister Rahina in the back.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله شيخ.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Such an honor, alhamdulillah, seeing you on the screen. I have been so much fascinated by your work, alhamdulillah. I have a question on, I'm so glad you brought up some of the challenges with, generally I would say with studying Islam here in the West, and you also talk about the damages done by Orientalism and colonialism in the ways that Islam is taught and even practiced. My training is I'm from Northern Nigeria. That's where I was born and raised, and my training is from the madrasa, traditional Islamic education. And I'm visiting here and teaching, and it's still a struggle for me to find a way to teach Islam, in a way that I feel it's morally right for me, and also fair to my both Muslim and non-Muslim students. I have taught earlier almost mainly in traditional setting where everyone is a Muslim, and the goal of learning is, as they say, وَمَا الْعِلْمُ إِلَّا الْعَمَلُ بِهِ. So the goal of learning was to learn to gain more piety. And then I find myself in a setting where the goal is different. And then I get confused. So I would like to hear from you if you have any advice for me. Thank you. Jazakumullah khair.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? Have you taught Islamic courses in secular institutions?
Yeah, I have. So this is my second year visiting here at the Harvard Divinity School, and I have taught 2 graduate courses.
Yeah. It's interesting. Teaching undergraduates is even more challenging than teaching graduate, because at least my attitude is that when I'm teaching, when I used to teach undergraduate courses, I haven't done it in quite a while, because in law schools you don't have that opportunity most of the time. But when I used to teach undergraduate courses in a secular setting, my attitude was that I am not what I am educating you on in these introductory courses is what Muslims believe about their religion. The fact that I am Muslim is irrelevant to my teaching of an undergraduate course. And I don't do the Orientalist thing of saying, I'm going to teach you what is objectively true, regardless of what Muslims believe about their religion. Because that's very colonial. That's exactly what is quite arrogant. What is relevant in any setting when you are teaching a foreign culture, the other, is how that other perceives the self, how that other understands its own history. And I tell them very frankly, it's not whether, even if I, for instance, disagree with the various prevalent ways of understanding an episode of Islamic history, my own take was often quite secondary. what was primary is to, this is a form of a cultural education for undergraduates to understand how Muslims construct their own tradition, how Muslims perceive their own history and their own theology. At a graduate level, I tend to expect from graduate students a greater level of maturity, in that I'm very open about my own beliefs as a Muslim. I am very open about sharing with them the different interpretations of the different perspectives of others. So, I'll say, the opinion of this scholar is this, the opinion of the following scholar is this, the opinion, and my own opinions, I agree or disagree, is the following, and I expect from them original thinking and an original input. Of course, levels of graduate students makes a difference. So first year graduate students, I'll deal with them very differently than graduate students that have been, third years or 4 years or so on. As first years, I deal with them closer to the undergraduate model. But once you get into second year graduate school, I think it is part of the pedagogical process, is that graduate students, and I expect from the graduate students, and this is, by the way, something that some graduate students have not liked at all and criticized me very strongly for, and others have praised me for, is that I told them it is not just relevant what the scholars in France and Britain said about a particular issue. Part of what I'm going to assign to you is what the scholars in Egypt or scholars in Indonesia or scholars in Saudi have said about the issue. I expect you to read these perspectives and tell me why you agree or disagree. And as I said, I'm very open about the fact that I'm a practicing Muslim, and if they think that affects my analysis somehow, I'm welcome their perspectives, their input about how they think. And this is something that, by the way, I've been challenged on quite often by graduate students from different perspectives. And I'm very happy to take it on, because I'll tell you that I learned in the law school that all the people who teach American law, it is presumed that the vast majority of those who teach American law have enormous commitment to the American legal system. Even those who are most critical of the American legal system, even those who come from a little, say, critical legal studies perspective. But ultimately, we've problematized the issue of objectivity to the point that, no one in law school takes the claim of objectivity very seriously. And if people can be normatively committed to a legal system, whether if they're French lawyers to the French legal system, if they're Russian lawyers to the Russian legal system, if they're American lawyers to the American legal system, and yet they are the differential authority on what is all matters relating to American law, why is it so different when it comes to Islamic law? Why is it that I cannot dare venture into issue or in any matter related to Jewish law without intellectually part of the program of what I have to deal with? What various pious, thoroughly committed Jewish lawyers have to say about the Jewish legal tradition. I cannot simply ignore that group. I cannot simply sidestep that group. I cannot overstep that group. They are an utterly, completely respectable part of the pedagogy of everything that relates to Jewish law. Why is it different when it comes to the Islamic law system? Why is it that there are very famous professors, one of them who has a very influential position in Islamic law because of the journal that he edits. Why is it that we have a discussion about where he informs me that anyone who is a practicing Muslim cannot possibly be a good scholar of Islamic law? Can you imagine generalizing that logic? You can try to be have the same attitude, same type of attitude about that a lot of Western scholars have on Islamic law, and try to have that same attitude about Jewish law and be a scholar of Jewish law. You will have no future. It is taken as a matter of an unrebuttable presumption that unless you are sufficiently sympathetic to a field, you cannot actually engage that field. Very different than the colonized field of Islamic studies that we have to endure. Is it time to break fast yet?
Yes, I apologize. I know it's time to break fast. I don't want to hold folks. But Dr. Abou Fadl, I just can't.
Why is it that in Boston it's you guys Maghrib is at 7:10?
I think because we're north, right? Dr. Abou Fadl is in Columbus, Ohio right now. But I think we're northeast, right? And
so it's not that the sun likes the Bostonians more than the Ohioans.
My being Bostonian privilege, going back to the first question. But no, genuinely, thank you so much, Dr. Abou Fadl.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure, and I'm sorry the bout of pain right before the event just was a bit of a challenge to overcome in speaking. So I apologize for parts where I've stumbled over my speech, but it was really a pleasure, and I really dream that all of you have stellar futures, that you achieve great things, and from my perspective, that you contribute to decolonizing Islamic studies, because it's really overdue.
Thank you, and please, you have nothing to apologize for. Thank you once again for your service to our Harvard community, your service to the greater Islamic community, our Ummah. I think I can speak for others in this room when I say I feel so empowered and just so grateful to you. So thank you once again. And for folks here, Assalamu alaikum. I want to remind you, we have some amazing mugs, some books, courtesy of Grace Song, Executive Director of the Asuli Institute. So please go ahead and get your copy and your mug. And iftar tonight is courtesy of Silk Road, a local Uyghur restaurant. Thank you again. Thank you, Sheikh. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum.